The final strike. The untold truths behind Zidane's World Cup nightmare. July 9th, 2006. Berlin's Olympiastadion. 69,000 people holding their breath as the greatest footballer of his generation walked past the World Cup trophy for the last time. But nobody, not the cameras, not the commentators, not even FIFA, knew the real story behind the 10 seconds that would haunt Zinedine Zidane forever. This is the story they never told you. The psychological warfare, the family honor, and the split-second decision that changed football history. The Golden Boy's last dance. Zidane entered that final as football royalty. At 34, this was supposed to be his perfect goodbye, a fairy tale ending to the career that had taken a kid from Marseille's concrete housing projects to the very summit of world football.
He'd already announced his retirement 6 months earlier, tearfully telling the world that this World Cup would be his swan song. The French media had dubbed it Zizou's last dance. Every match became a pilgrimage, every touch a potential final memory. Against Spain in the round of 16, he'd orchestrated a masterclass. Against Brazil in the quarter-finals, he'd outplayed Ronaldinho, Ronaldo, and Kaká combined. Against Portugal in the semi-finals, he defied age itself, gliding across the pitch like a man half his age. For 100 minutes in that final, the script played out perfectly. Zidane scored from the penalty spot with the audacity that defined his career. A Panenka chip that floated past Gianluigi Buffon like a butterfly with deadly precision. The stadium erupted. French flags waved in the stands. This was destiny unfolding. But football, cruel and beautiful, had other plans. The architect of destruction. Marco Materazzi wasn't just Italy's defensive enforcer. He was their psychological weapon. Standing 6'4", with the build of a heavyweight boxer, he specialized in getting inside opponents' heads. His teammates called him the Matrix for his ability to bend reality, to make even the calmest players lose their composure. Materazzi had done his homework on Zidane. He knew about the Frenchman's Algerian heritage, how his parents, Smail and Malika, had immigrated to Marseille in the 1950s seeking a better life. He knew about Zidane's fierce protective instincts toward his family. Most importantly, he knew that beneath the zen-like exterior was a street fighter from La Castellane, one of France's toughest neighborhoods. I studied him for weeks. His weaknesses weren't technical. They were emotional. The concrete jungle that forged a legend. To understand what happened next, you need to understand where Zidane came from. La Castellane wasn't just poor, it was forgotten. A maze of concrete towers where unemployment reached 40%, where young men grew up faster than they should, where respect was earned with fists as much as words. Young Zinedine learned early that family was everything. When neighborhood kids mocked his Algerian surname, he fought back. When older boys tried to steal his football, he fought back. When anyone disrespected his parents or siblings, he fought back. His father Smail had worked night shifts as a warehouseman for decades, never complaining, always providing. His mother Malika had raised 5 children, like cleaning offices before dawn. They'd sacrificed everything, so their son could chase a football dream that seemed impossible from the concrete courtyards of La Castellane. This was the foundation of Zidane's character: fierce loyalty, unbreakable pride, and a code of honor that no trophy could compromise. The hunter becomes the hunted.
What the world didn't see was the cat-and-mouse game that had been building throughout the match. From the opening whistle, Materazzi had been assigned one job: neutralize Zidane by any means necessary. It started with small provocations, a subtle elbow here, a late challenge there. Words whispered during corner kicks, insults disguised as tactical instructions. Materazzi was playing a different game entirely, not football, but psychological warfare. Every time he touched the ball, I was there, Materazzi later admitted. Not just physically, but mentally. I wanted him to know I was watching, waiting. For 90 minutes, Zidane remained composed. The master of the mental game seemed immune to Materazzi's tactics, He'd faced worse defenders, survived nastier battles. At 34, with 3 Ballon d'Or trophies and a World Cup already in his collection, what could possibly rattle the man who had seen everything football could throw at him? But Materazzi was patient. He was waiting for the perfect moment, the exact situation where his words would cut deepest. The perfect storm. Extra time in a World Cup final creates its own atmosphere. Legs become heavier, minds become cloudier, emotions run closer to the surface. Both teams were exhausted, running on pure adrenaline and the knowledge that one mistake could decide everything. It was during this heightened state that Materazzi made his move. The moment came during a break in play as both players jogged back into position. Materazzi had been tugging at Zidane's shirt, a common occurrence in football. Zidane, irritated, had made his now famous comment, "If you want my shirt, I'll give it to you after the game." What happened next would remain one of football's most guarded secrets for almost 2 decades. Materazzi leaned closer and whispered something that made Zidane's entire body language change. The words weren't about football, weren't about the match, weren't about anything that belonged on a football pitch. They were about Zidane's sister. The words that broke a legend, "I prefer the whore that is your sister," Materazzi had said in Italian. These weren't heat-of-the-moment words. They were calculated, chosen specifically because Materazzi knew they would destroy Zidane's composure. In Algerian culture, in Mediterranean culture, in any culture that values family honor above all else, these words weren't just an insult. They were a declaration of war. For Zidane, they were unforgivable. The 10 seconds that changed everything. Picture this moment in slow motion. The greatest player of his generation, 6 steps away from football immortality, walking away from words that should have been forgotten in seconds. His teammates were already thinking about penalty kicks. French fans were dreaming of glory. But something primal had been awakened in Zidane. The sophisticated playmaker disappeared, replaced by the street fighter from Le Castellane, who had learned that some insults demand an immediate response.
Zidane stopped walking.
For a moment that lasted an eternity, he stood frozen between 2 versions of himself, the global icon and the neighborhood kid who would never let anyone disrespect his family. The neighborhood kid won. Zidane turned around, his eyes locked on Materazzi. He took 1 step, then another, then another. 6 steps that covered 10 yards and 20 years of buried instincts. The man who had built his reputation on ice-cold precision, who had scored in 2 World Cup finals, who had never lost his cool when it mattered most. He lowered his head like a battering ram and drove it into Materazzi's chest with the force of 2 decades of suppressed rage. Materazzi crumpled to the ground as if struck by lightning. The stadium fell silent. Referee Horacio Elizondo reached for his pocket, and the red card that emerged seemed to glow under the floodlights. The walk of shame that became legendary. The longest walk in football history began. Past his devastated teammates, past the French bench, where his coach Raymond Domenech sat in stunned silence. Past 30,000 French supporters who couldn't believe what they'd witnessed. But, strangest of all, past the World Cup trophy itself, football's ultimate prize sitting on its pedestal, gleaming under the lights, now forever beyond his reach. Television cameras followed every step, capturing the most complex expression in sports history. There was no defiance, no regret, no anger, just acceptance. The acceptance of a man who had made his choice and would live with the consequences. In the tunnel, away from the cameras, Zidane sat alone on a bench. His France shirt, the same one he'd worn to score that perfect penalty, now felt like a weight around his shoulders. 20 years of professional football ended by 10 seconds of street justice. The penalty shootout that never should have happened. Without their captain, their leader, their talisman, France fell apart. The penalty shootout that followed felt hollow, predetermined. Italy scored all 5 of their penalties with mechanical precision. France, traumatized by their leader's exit, missed their 4th through David Trezeguet. As Italian players celebrated and French players collapsed in despair, one question echoed around the world. How could the greatest player of his generation throw it all away for a moment of madness? The aftermath nobody saw coming. But here's what shocked the football world. Instead of condemning Zidane, France embraced him. Instead of shame, there was understanding. The man who should have been vilified became more beloved than ever. The French media, known for their harsh criticism, rallied behind their fallen hero. L'Equipe's headline read, "The Magnificent Failure." Le Figaro declared, "Even in defeat, our dignity intact." French politicians from across the political spectrum defended Zidane's actions. President Jacques Chirac himself called Zidane personally. "You are and will remain our champion. What you did was unacceptable. But we understand why you did it." Why? Because in that moment of madness, Zidane had shown something that transcended football. He had shown that some things matter more than trophies: family honor, personal dignity, the values that his Algerian immigrant parents had instilled in him in those tough Marseille neighborhoods. The code of the streets. In La Castellane, where Zidane had learned to play football on concrete courts, surrounded by graffiti-covered walls, his actions weren't seen as a failure. They were seen as inevitable. You could take the boy out of the neighborhood, but you couldn't take the neighborhood out of the boy. "In our culture, family is sacred," explained Zidane's childhood friend Jamel. What Materazzi said wasn't just an insult. It was an attack on Zinedine's mother, his sister, his entire family. Any man from our neighborhood would have done the same thing. This was the code Zidane lived by. Respect everyone, but never tolerate disrespect of your family. It had guided him through 20 years of professional football without major incident. But when that line was crossed in the most public way possible, the code demanded satisfaction. The secret Materazzi kept. For years, Materazzi stayed silent about his exact words. FIFA investigated, but found nothing concrete. Lip readers offered different interpretations. French newspapers published dozens of theories. The mystery only grew Zidane's legend. Materazzi became public enemy #1 in France overnight. French fans sent him death threats. Someone hacked his Wikipedia page to list his profession as professional bastard. Italian police had to provide him with personal security. But the Italian defender refused to reveal what he had said. "It was between me and him," he insisted for years. "The world doesn't need to know." Some said it was professional courtesy, one warrior respecting another's privacy. Others believed Materazzi knew that revealing the truth would only make him look worse. Either way, his silence turned the headbutt into football's greatest unsolved mystery, the confession that came too late. It wasn't until 2024, 18 years after that fateful night in Berlin, that Materazzi finally revealed the complete truth in an Italian television documentary. By then, both men had retired. Both had found peace with what happened. "I said terrible things about his family," Materazzi admitted, his voice heavy with what seemed like regret. "I attacked the most sacred thing in his culture, in any culture. I was trying to win a football match, but I went too far, much too far." The revelation shocked no one and everyone simultaneously. Zidane's supporters felt vindicated. Their hero had been justified all along. Materazzi's defenders felt betrayed. How could they defend the indefensible? But by then, the narrative had already been written. Zidane wasn't the villain of the 2006 World Cup final. He was its tragic hero. The legacy of a moment. Today, nearly 2 decades later, Zidane's headbutt isn't remembered as football's greatest shame. It's remembered as its most human moment. A reminder that beneath the superhuman skills and ice-cold precision was a man who would never compromise his principles, even for the World Cup. That 10-second walk back to Materazzi defined Zidane more than any of his 3 Ballon d'Or trophies, more than his Champions League victories, more than his World Cup triumphs in 1998. It showed the world that the kid from La Castellane, no matter how far he'd climbed, would always be that kid from La Castellane. From global icon back to neighborhood defender. From untouchable superstar back to protective big brother. From Zinedine Zidane, football legend, back to Zizou from the projects, who would fight anyone who disrespected his family. The ultimate redemption. The story doesn't end in that Berlin tunnel. It ends in Madrid, where Zidane found his true calling as a coach, where he won 3 consecutive Champions League titles with Real Madrid, something no coach had done in the modern era, where he proved that success isn't measured only in moments of perfection, but in how you respond to moments of failure. The headbutt had cost France the World Cup, but it had given the world something more valuable: proof that authentic people still existed in professional sports. That, underneath all the marketing and media training and corporate sponsors, there was still a human being who would sacrifice everything for principles that couldn't be bought or sold. The final truth. In the end, maybe the headbutt was the most Zidane thing of all: unpredictable, passionate, uncompromising. A moment of madness that revealed a lifetime of integrity. The World Cup trophy went to Italy that night in Berlin, but Zidane walked away with something more valuable: his dignity intact, his family honor defended, and a legacy that proved some things are worth more than winning. In La Castellane, where concrete courtyards had shaped a future legend, the old men still gather to play dominoes and tell stories. And when young boys ask about their neighborhood's most famous son, they don't talk about his goals or his trophies. They talk about the night he chose family over glory, principles over prizes, and proved that you can take the boy out of the neighborhood, but you can never take the neighborhood out of the boy. That's the real story of Zinedine Zidane's headbutt. Not a moment of madness, but a moment of truth. The truth about who he really was, and who he would always be. The kid from Marseille who conquered the world, but never forgot where he came from.